The morning Wilhelmina Wilcox drove her wagon into Dusthaven, New Mexico territory, with nothing but a wooden crate of rose cuttings, a cracked leather satchel, and two mules named Sunday and Patience. Every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared at her like she had ridden straight out of a fever dream. It was the spring of 1878, and Dusthaven was exactly what its name promised. A flat, wind-hammered stretch of high desert scrub where the sun came down like a judgment, and the earth cracked open in the summer heat like old bread. The Rio Seco ran dry 8 months of the year, and what little rain fell in late July usually arrived with enough fury to wash out the road and not enough generosity to actually nourish anything. The old-timers said nothing grew in Dusthaven unless it had thorns or fangs. They said it proudly, like suffering was a badge worth wearing. Wilhelmina Wilcox, 26 years old with dust in her dark hair and a set to her jaw that could have broken stone, did not look like a woman who had heard that particular piece of wisdom. Or perhaps she had heard it and decided it was wrong. She pulled her wagon to a stop in front of the land office, climbed down with the kind of deliberate grace that suggested she had been climbing down from wagons all her life, and went inside to register the 40 acres her late uncle had left her in a handwritten will that the solicitor in Santa Fe had called, with barely concealed disdain, optimistic. Abraham Vaughn watched her from across the street. He was leaning against the post of Hargrove's feed store with his arms folded and his hat pulled low, the way a man leans when he has been standing in the same general posture for about 30 years and no longer has to think about it. He was 34, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that came from spending every waking hour under a sky that did not forgive inattention. He ran the largest cattle operation in the territory, the Broken Spur Ranch, which occupied nearly 800 acres of land that abutted the parcel Wilhelmina Wilcox had just walked into the land office to claim. He had known the land was being inherited. Old Carter Wilcox had been his neighbor for 15 years before the cholera took him the previous autumn, and Carter had mentioned a niece more than once, always with a fond, slightly bewildered expression, as though the niece were a natural phenomenon rather than a person. She grows things, Carter had said once, sitting on Abraham's porch with a glass of rye. She grows things in places things have no business growing. Abraham had nodded politely and thought nothing more of it. He was thinking about it now. He watched her come back out of the land office with her papers folded and tucked under her arm, watched her check on her mules with a murmured word and a pat on the flank, and watched her study the road leading south out of town toward the land that was now hers. She stood there for a long moment, shading her eyes with one hand, looking out at the brown and broken landscape the way a general might study a battlefield. Then she climbed back onto the wagon and drove south. Abraham pushed himself off the post and went to collect his horse. He told himself he was heading home anyway. His property was south of town, same as hers, and it would have been strange to go the long way around. He told himself he was not following her. He was a reasonable man who happened to be going in the same direction. He caught up to her wagon about a mile out of town where the road narrowed between two low ridges of red rock. He slowed his horse to match her pace, and she glanced over at him with dark eyes that were several degrees cooler than the afternoon sun. "You the welcome committee," she said. "No, ma'am," he said. "I am your neighbor, Abraham Vaughn, Broken Spur Ranch." He tipped his hat. "I knew your uncle." Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but becoming less guarded. "He spoke of you," she said, "favorably mostly." "Mostly," Abraham repeated. "He said you offered him a fair price for his land twice and an unfair one once." She glanced back at the road ahead. "I will give you credit for the fair ones." Abraham was quiet for a moment. He had made that unfair offer during the 3rd year of the drought when Carter's cattle had died and the old man was desperate, and Abraham had a different sense of himself then. He was not proud of it. "He was right to hold out," he said finally. "He was," she agreed. "And now I hold it." "Yes, ma'am." He kept his horse beside her wagon. If you do not mind my asking, what do you intend to do with it? Grow roses, she said. The silence that followed was the particular kind that forms when a person says something so unexpected that the air itself needs a moment to process it. Roses, Abraham said. And other things, she allowed. Herbs, vegetables, some fruit trees if the soil responds well, but roses first. I have 73 cuttings in that crate. Rosa damascena, Rosa gallica, and a variety from a woman in Albuquerque that nobody has named yet, but that blooms the deepest red I have ever seen. She said this with the calm precision of a person stating established facts. I have been testing them in progressively harsher conditions for 6 years. These are the ones that survived everything I could throw at them. Abraham looked at the land around them, the cracked caliche, the sparse gray-green of creosote and desert sage, the red dust that coated everything. Miss Wilcox, he said, and he tried to say it gently, this is the driest land in the territory. I know, she said. People have tried to grow things here. They have failed. People have tried to grow what grows in Virginia or Ohio or Missouri, she said. I am trying to grow something. I have spent 6 years selecting for exactly this climate. She glanced at him again, and there was no arrogance in her face, only the quiet certainty of someone who has done the work and knows what the work means. I am not expecting you to believe me, Mr. Vaughn. I am not asking you to. He rode with her to the edge of her property line and then pulled his horse to a stop, watching her continue down the rutted track toward the small stone house Carter had built 20 years ago. She sat very straight on the wagon seat. The crate of rose cuttings sat beside her, wrapped in damp burlap. He watched her until she disappeared around the side of the house. Then he turned his horse toward home and thought about what she had said for the rest of the evening. The following weeks were a revelation, not because anything miraculous happened immediately, but because of the sheer methodical determination with which Wilhelmina Wilcox went about her work. Abraham could see her from his north pasture fence line. It was about a quarter mile, but the land was flat enough that on a clear morning he could make out her figure moving across the brown earth. She was up before dawn every day, hauling water from the cistern Carter had built, which she had immediately gone to work expanding. She had hired 2 men from town, brothers named Felix and Dario Espinoza, who were good workers and known for their honesty, and the 3 of them dug a second cistern and a series of shallow irrigation channels that she had sketched out in a small leather notebook she carried everywhere. She paid Felix and Dario fairly, which was noted in town because not everyone did. She planted her rose cuttings in a pattern that puzzled everyone who heard about it, including Abraham, who heard about it from Felix when Felix came to buy feed. She planted them in groups, with spaces between, and around each group she planted native plants: desert willow, Apache plume, 4 o'clock flowers as windbreaks and companions. She mulched heavily with straw she bought from Abraham's own stock, which he sold her at the standard price because he had decided firmly that he was not going to give her any special consideration in either direction. He was also not going to watch her from the fence line more than was reasonable. He watched her from the fence line most mornings. About 3 weeks after her arrival, a dry wind came down from the mountains to the north and lasted 4 days. It stripped the moisture from everything, cracked lips and nostrils, killed 2 of Samuel Hargrove's chickens outright. On the 2nd day of the wind, Abraham rode his fence line and saw Wilhelmina out in her rose beds with a collection of cloth pieces she was rigging up on small poles as wind barriers. She worked steadily and without hurry, moving from one planting group to the next, tying and adjusting, her dark hair wrapped in a cloth to keep the dust out. He did not stop. He told himself she did not need his help. On the 4th day of the wind he did stop, because he saw her struggling with a cloth that had come loose from its pole in the gusting air, the fabric whipping around her and threatening to tear. He dismounted, tied his horse to the fence post and climbed over. "Hold the pole," she said, without looking up, as though she had known he was coming. He held the pole while she lashed the cloth back in place with experienced hands. "Thank you," she said when it was done. She stood back and surveyed the beds. The rose cuttings were small still, barely more than sticks with a few cautious leaves, but they were green. Every one of them was green. "They are alive," Abraham said in a tone that came out more surprised than he intended. "They are," she said. She looked at him with that dark, level gaze. "You can say it." "Say what?" "That you did not expect them to last this long." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who valued honesty, and she had just offered him the space to use it. "I gave them 2 weeks," he admitted. "Maybe 3. She nodded, as though this was exactly what she had expected him to say. "Most people do," she said. I stopped being bothered by it. She bent down and pressed her fingers gently into the soil around the base of one cutting, checking the moisture level. "Come back in 6 months, Mr. Vaughn." He came back in 3 days to return a bucket she had lent to Felix when one of his broke. And the visit stretched to an hour because she had questions about the water table and the seasonal patterns of the Rio Seco's underground aquifer. Questions that were surprisingly specific and well-informed. And Abraham found himself at the kitchen table of Carter's old stone house with a cup of coffee that was better than anything he had managed to produce in his own kitchen for years. Talking about water and soil and the particular cruelty of the New Mexico summer with a kind of engagement he had not felt in a conversation for longer than he could precisely identify. She had made the house her own in a matter of weeks. There were herbs drying from the ceiling beams and seed packets labeled in a precise handwriting stacked on the windowsill, and there was a sketch pinned to the wall that he studied while she refilled his cup, a plan of the property, covered in annotations, with symbols he did not recognize marking different zones. "What are the circles?" he asked. "Microclimates," she said. "Places where the soil composition or the angle of shelter creates slightly different conditions. I mapped them the first week." She set his cup down. "Your uncle's land has more variation than it appears. There is a depression on the south side where moisture accumulates. There is a shelf of rock on the east that holds heat into the evening and extends the growing season." She touched the map as she spoke, and her confidence was not performance, it was knowledge. "I am working with what is here rather than against it." Abraham looked at the map and then at her. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked. "My mother," she said, and her voice changed very slightly on the word, became quieter. "She was a botanist. Self-taught because universities do not accept women, but a botanist. She spent her whole life studying how plants adapt." She paused. "She died when I was 16. I have been continuing her work since then." There was nothing he could say to that would not be inadequate, so he said nothing and simply looked at the map for another moment. "She would have loved this place," Wilhelmina said quietly, half to herself. "All this stubborn, difficult, dry, impossible land. She would have loved the challenge of it." Abraham thought about that on the ride home. He thought about it for several days afterward. The summer arrived in June the way it always did in Dusthaven, without mercy or apology. By the end of June, the temperature was hitting 110 degrees in the afternoon, and the ground looked like the surface of a cracked plate. The Rio Seco's surface water was entirely gone, as it always was. 2 ranchers on the north side of town had already lost cattle to heat exhaustion, and the mood in Dusthaven's single saloon, the Lucky Strike, was the particular grim kind that settled over people when they looked at the sky and saw nothing useful coming. Wilhelmina Wilcox worked through the heat the way she worked through everything, with method. She had adjusted her schedule so that all heavy outdoor work was done in the 2 hours after dawn and the hour before sunset. In the heat of the day, she worked in the shade of the house, doing propagation work, keeping records, writing letters to other botanists and horticulturalists across the territory and beyond, gathering information with the steady industry of a scholar who knows that knowledge is cumulative. Her roses did not die. This was remarkable enough that people in town began to talk about it by July. Felix Espinosa mentioned it at the feed store. A woman named Clara Lund, who ran the dry goods establishment and had a sharp ear for interesting information, rode out to see for herself and came back reporting that the Wilcox woman had actual living green plants growing in those beds and not just surviving but putting out new growth. Abraham did not ride out that week. He had told himself he was giving her space, which was partly true. The other part was harder to name. He was 40 years old when his wife Sarah had died of a fever 6 years ago, and in the 6 years since, he had organized his life around the ranch with an efficiency that left very little room for the sort of internal disorder that conversations with Wilhelmina Wilcox tended to produce. He was not a man who frightened easily, but he was a man who was careful, particularly about things that mattered. He went out on a Sunday in mid-July, telling himself he had a legitimate errand, which he did. He had a message from Felix about a scheduling conflict. He found her in the rose beds in the early morning light, and he stopped at the fence line and looked. The cuttings had become plants. Not large ones, not yet, but real plants with genuine stems and leaves, and here and there he had to look twice because it seemed impossible. Here and there, small tight buds. He climbed over the fence. "Mr. Vaughn," she said, not turning around. She was the only person he knew who always seemed to hear him coming. "Miss Wilcox," he said. He came and stood beside her and looked at the nearest plant, which had 3 buds on it, closed tight as fists. "They are budding." "They are," she said. She was smiling just slightly in the way of someone who has been waiting for something and seen it arrive precisely on schedule. "In July," he said. "In Dusthaven." "In Dusthaven," she confirmed. He stood there for a long moment in the early morning with the heat already building around them and the smell of the desert beginning to rise. And he looked at the roses that should not have existed on the driest land in the territory. And he thought about a woman who had spent 6 years selecting plants for exactly this, who had inherited stubborn and difficult land and made a map of its microclimates in her first week, who drank coffee at 4 in the morning and worked until the heat became impossible and then worked again at dusk, and he thought that he had never in his life encountered a person quite like her. "Miss Wilcox," he said. "Yes. Would you like to have dinner at my house this Saturday if you are free?" He said it quickly, the way a man says something he has been thinking about for longer than he would like to admit. "I am not a sophisticated cook, but I am adequate." She turned and looked at him fully then. Her expression was thoughtful, assessing, the same way she looked at the land when she was trying to understand its possibilities. "All right," she said. "Saturday." He nodded, and because he did not trust himself to say anything else that would come out sensibly, he touched his hat and went back to his horse. He spent 3 days deciding what to cook and another day buying supplies, which led to a conversation with Clara Lund at the dry goods store that he deeply regretted, because Clara was the most efficient news distribution system in the territory, and by Thursday afternoon, every person in Dusthaven knew that Abraham Vaughn had invited the Rose woman to dinner. His ranch foreman, a quiet, capable man named George Tillman who had worked for him for 11 years, said nothing about it directly, but on Friday he polished the dining table without being asked, and Abraham chose not to comment on this. She arrived at 6 o'clock on Saturday evening in a wagon that she drove herself, wearing a dark blue dress that was simple and well-made and suited her exactly, with her dark hair pinned up. She brought a small jar of honey she had gotten from a beekeeper in Albuquerque, which she handed to him at the door with a practical directness, as though she had thought about what to bring and settled on something useful. He had made roasted chicken and roasted potatoes and a bean dish that George had given him the recipe for, and it was better than adequate, which was something of a relief. They ate on the porch because the evening was cooling, and the view of the mountains to the east was the best thing about the Broken Spurs location, and they talked through the meal and through the sunset and into the dark, and somewhere in the middle of that, Abraham became aware that he was having the best evening he had experienced in a very long time. She told him about her childhood in St. Louis, where her mother had grown a garden that was the talk of the neighborhood, and a father who was a printer and a good man who had been quietly devastated when her mother died. She told him about the years after, learning and studying and working, taking her mother's research forward with the same attention and care her mother had given it. She had lived in several places, Kansas, Colorado, a year in Arizona, always testing, always learning. She had no husband, had never been engaged, which she mentioned without particular emphasis, simply as a fact about her history. He told her about Sarah, which he rarely did. He told her about the early years of the ranch, the struggle to build something real out of dry land and hard work, the years that had been brutal and the years that had been good. He told her about the winter of 1872 when they had lost nearly the whole herd to a blizzard and rebuilt from nothing, and how that winter had taught him that the difference between a ranch that survives and one that fails is the ability to keep going when every reasonable instinct says to stop. "That is what you saw in your uncle," she said. She was leaning forward with her elbows on the porch rail, looking at the stars that were coming out thick and bright over the mountains. "The stubbornness to stay. He was the most stubborn man I ever knew," Abraham said. "Second most stubborn, maybe now." She looked at him sideways and he saw the smile. "He believed in that land," Abraham said. "He just did not know what to do with it. He kept trying to run cattle on it the way I run cattle on mine, and the land kept telling him it was not a cattle land." "It is not," she agreed. "It is something else." She looked out into the dark. "I think land is like people. You cannot make it be what it is not. You have to find out what it actually is." He thought about that for a long time after she drove home, the lantern on her wagon swinging slowly until it disappeared around the mesa. August came with its full weight of heat, and the rose buds opened. Abraham was at the fence line when it happened. He had been riding his north pasture that morning and had stopped without thinking about it. The way you stop when you see something that your mind has not yet processed but your body has recognized as important. From a quarter-mile away he could see the color. Red. Not the washed-out dusty red of the desert rock, but a deep, saturated, impossible red, scattered across the brown ground of Wilhelmina's beds like something spilled from a better world. He dismounted and tied his horse and walked the quarter-mile without deciding to. She was standing in the middle of the beds when he arrived, and she was not doing anything. She was simply standing there looking at the blooms, and her face had an expression he had not seen on it before, open and unguarded, something between triumph and grief and pure simple joy. He had the sense that she was seeing her mother's work come to completion in this bloom, that she was seeing years of study and selection and patient testing arrive at this moment on this impossible ground. He stopped at the edge of the bed and looked at the flowers. They were extraordinary. Full-petaled and fragrant, the scent reaching him even in the dry desert air, and the red was exactly what she had described, the deepest red he had ever seen, richer than anything he had seen growing in this territory or any other. They were real. They were blooming. On the driest land in the territory, in the full fury of a Dusthaven August, they were blooming. He looked at her. "I believe you now," he said. She turned to look at him, and whatever guard she had kept up between them since the beginning softened in that moment. In that August morning, with the red roses blooming all around them and the heat building over the desert scrub. "You did not before," she said, and there was laughter in it, warm and real. "I believed you were serious," he said. "I believed you were capable, but this," he gestured at the beds, at the impossible red flowers. "This I had to see." She walked toward him through the beds, careful not to step on anything, and stopped a few feet away. 6 years, she said. 6 years I have been working toward this specific thing. My mother started it. She grew the first drought-tolerant cutting in a dry summer in Kansas when I was 12 years old, and I have been building on that ever since. She looked back at the flowers. She never got to see it get here, this far, this extreme. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the current beneath it. "She would have been so pleased." "She would have been," Abraham said. "She raised you after all." Wilhelmina looked at him again, and there was something in that look that he did not try to define or deflect. He simply held it, the way you hold something that you know is fragile and valuable. "Thank you for coming to see," she said. "I do not think there was any stopping me," he said honestly. She smiled, and it was the full, unguarded version. the one he had been seeing glimpses of since that first dinner, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with the force of something that had been held at a distance for too long. "Come and smell them," she said, and turned back into the beds. He followed her, and they walked among the roses in the August heat, and she told him the name of each variety and its particular qualities, and he listened with an attention he gave to very few things in his life, and the morning moved around them like water. Word spread through Dusthaven the way word always spread, fast and thorough, and with some embellishment, though in this case the truth was already remarkable enough to need no help. Felix and Dario Espinosa told their families. Clara Lund closed the dry goods store at noon on a Wednesday, which she had never done in 12 years, to ride out and see. The schoolteacher, a young man named Harold Betts, brought his students on what he called an educational visit. The circuit preacher, Reverend Samuel Oakes, who passed through Dusthaven every 6 weeks, stood at the edge of Wilhelmina's beds and said, with genuine emotion, that he had not believed in miracles before this particular August, but he was open to revising his position. There were also less welcome responses. A man named Court Dillard, who owned a substantial piece of land to the west and had never been a particularly agreeable neighbor to anyone, came by one afternoon while Wilhelmina was out checking her irrigation channels and spoke to Felix in the yard. Felix came to find Wilhelmina afterward with an expression that he wore when he was doing his best to report an unpleasant thing neutrally. He said this was Carter's land and that Carter told him before he died he was planning to sell, Felix said. "Carter left the land to me in a will," Wilhelmina said. "I know that, Miss Wilcox. I am just telling you what he said." Felix paused. "He also said that women do not know how to manage property and that he could offer you a fair price to take it off your hands." Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment. She was holding her irrigation notebook and her fingers tightened slightly on it. "What did you say?" she asked Felix. "I told him that the property was doing fine and that you were not in the market to sell," Felix said. "He did not seem to appreciate that." "I imagine he did not," she said. She made a note in her notebook and moved to the next channel. "Thank you, Felix." She told Abraham about it the next time she saw him, which was 2 days later when he came to buy back some of his own fence posts that Felix had accidentally borrowed and not returned. And Abraham's expression as she told the story went through several changes, none of them indicating particular warmth toward Court Dillard. "He has been trying to expand west for 3 years, Abraham said. "He has bought out 4 smaller operations. He does not usually resort to anything besides pressure and persistence, but persistence can be enough." "I am familiar with persistence," Wilhelmina said. "I know you are," he said, "but you should also know that if he causes you any actual trouble, you are not alone in this." He said it simply, without performance. "I will stand with you in front of the land office or in front of the county judge or wherever it needs to happen." She studied him. "Why?" He looked back at her without flinching. "Because you are my neighbor and you have done something worth protecting," he said. And then, after a pause that was only a second but felt longer, "and because I would like to, Wilhelmina." It was the first time he had used her name, the full name, her whole name. She heard it and something shifted inside her, something she had kept carefully in place since she arrived because she could not afford to have it move while there was work to be done. "All right," she said. "Abraham." He nodded once, and the nodding had a weight to it, an acknowledgement of something that neither of them was going to name out loud quite yet. Court Dillard came himself 2 weeks later, in the early morning, driving a smart buggy with a man she did not know riding beside him. Wilhelmina was alone in the yard, Felix and Dario not due for another hour. She set down the watering can she was holding and waited. Dillard was a thick-necked man of about 50, with a sun-roughened face, and the kind of confidence that comes from having been accommodated by the world for long enough to forget that the world could say no. He climbed down from the buggy and stood in the yard and looked at her rose beds with an expression that was calculated to be dismissive. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "I will not waste your time with pleasantries. I want to make you a serious offer for this property. Carter's little experiment with this land never paid, and flowers are not a going concern in a place like this. You could sell, take the money, and go back to wherever you came from and be better off for it. I came from St. Louis, she said pleasantly, but this is where I am from now. She picked up her watering can. I'm not selling, Mr. Dillard. You are being short-sighted, he said. The pleasantness left his voice. This land is worth more to someone who knows what to do with it. Someone who knows what to do with it is currently living on it, she said. She met his eyes without drama. I will say good morning to you now. Dillard looked at her for a long moment and then at the man beside him and then back at her. You will reconsider, he said. I will not, she said. He left. But he left the way a man leaves when he is planning to come back, and Wilhelmina watched the buggy until it was out of sight, and then finished her watering with steady hands and told herself that she had dealt with worse. She went to see Abraham that evening. She had not gone to him with a problem before, had not asked for help with anything except that fence cloth in the wind, and walking up to his porch in the cooling evening felt different from their other visits in a way she was still deciding how to handle. But she had thought about what he said, about not being alone, and she had decided that accepting help when it was genuinely offered was not weakness. He came to the door when she knocked, and his face when he saw her shifted from its usual contained expression into something warmer, something more open, and he held the door and said, "Come in, please," with a courtesy that was instinctive rather than performed. She told him about Dillard's visit. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, his hands around a cup of coffee on the table between them. I will speak to Sam Oakes when he comes through next week, he said. He has legal knowledge. More usefully, I will write to the county judge tomorrow. Your title is clean, but there is no harm in having the judge aware of the situation before Dillard decides to manufacture a claim. He paused. And I would like to ride my north fence line rather more frequently in the mornings for a while, if you do not mind. I do not mind, she said. Dillard has never done anything violent, Abraham said carefully, but pressure takes many forms. I know, she said. Thank you. I am not, she stopped, reformulated. I am not accustomed to asking for help. I have been managing alone for a long time. I know, he said, and his voice was quiet. You do not have to stop managing alone. You are very good at it. But you do not have to always do it alone either. He looked at her across the table, and the lamplight was warm between them. Those are not the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment. He had a steady face, a face that had been through things and come out of them still intact, still honest, and she found that she trusted it in a way that had been building since that first morning beside the fence line. I think, she said carefully, that you are becoming very important to me, Abraham. He was quiet for several seconds. Outside, a night bird was calling somewhere in the dark mesquite. You have been important to me for a while now, he said. I have been waiting for the right time to say it clearly. He set down his cup. I am not a man who does things in a hurry as a rule, but I am also not a man who likes to let the important things go unsaid. No, she agreed softly. Neither am I. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away. She did not move away. His hand was calloused and warm and large, and she turned hers over beneath it so their palms were touching. I would like to court you properly, he said. If you will let me. She smiled, and it was the full, unguarded smile, the real one. I think you have been doing it since August, she said. But yes. Formally, let us say yes. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh freely, without reservation, and it was one of the best sounds she had encountered in her 26 years of paying attention to the world. The county judge wrote back within a week confirming that the Wilcox land title was clean and recorded, and that any challenge to it would need to be brought through proper legal channels with proper evidentiary support, which was not the kind of thing Dillard could manufacture easily. The judge also noted, in a personal postscript that Abraham read aloud to Wilhelmina on his porch, that he had heard about the roses and was planning to visit Dusthaven next time he was in the area. Dillard made no further move that autumn. though he watched from a distance the way a disappointed man watches something he wanted and could not have. Wilhelmina noted his occasional presence on the road without concern. She had documentation, she had allies, and she had Abraham Vaughn riding his north fence line with a regularity that was not subtle. September brought a dry but slightly cooler stretch, and the roses produced a second round of blooms, which was not common for newly established plants in a new climate, and which made Wilhelmina's eyes go bright when she saw the first new buds. She was writing about it in the kitchen at dawn when Abraham knocked on the door, and she let him in still in her work apron and with ink on her fingers, and he looked at the pages spread across the table and the brightness in her face and said, "Good news." And she said, "Come and see," and took his hand and pulled him out to the beds. He let himself be pulled. He had been doing that more often lately, letting himself move toward rather than maintaining the careful distance of the years since Sarah. Wilhelmina was not a woman who demanded that movement. She never pushed. She simply existed in her specific, determined, extraordinary way, and the gravity of it was enough to do the work without any assistance from either of them. He stood beside her in the September morning and looked at the new buds and felt something ease in him that had been held tight for a long time. "They are coming back," she said. "They are," he said. She was still holding his hand. He was aware of this in every detail. "My mother used to say," Wilhelmina said, "that plants teach you that nothing good happens quickly, that patience is not passive, that you are always doing something even when it looks like you are standing still." She looked up at him. "Waiting is a form of work." "I have been learning that," he said. She squeezed his hand and let go, moving into the beds to check the new growth more carefully. And he stayed at the edge and watched her, and thought that he was the luckiest rancher in the New Mexico territory, and possibly in the entire American West. October arrived, and with it the first autumn rains, tentative and brief but present, and Wilhelmina's irrigation system captured every drop in the cisterns while her beds absorbed the rest. The roses went dormant by the end of the month in the way of healthy established plants, settling into the soil for winter rather than giving up, and she pruned them with the careful expertise of someone who knows the difference between dead and resting. She was also, by October, a minor legend in Dusthaven. Clara Lund had written about her to a friend in Santa Fe, and that friend had written to someone at the territorial newspaper, and a journalist had arrived in September with a notebook and a determined expression. Wilhelmina had spoken to him for an hour about drought-tolerant horticulture and the applications for agriculture in arid territories, and he had published a piece in the Santa Fe New Mexican that was both accurate and admiring, and that generated more mail for Wilhelmina than she could answer in a single sitting. Letters came from women in similar situations, from settlers trying to make difficult land productive, from a botanist in Texas who wanted to exchange research, from a woman in Colorado who grew vegetables in a climate everyone had told her was too harsh. Wilhelmina answered all of them, with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything. She read some of the letters to Abraham in the evenings, when they sat on one porch or the other as the autumn came in, and he listened and asked questions that showed he was actually thinking about what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. This, she had come to understand, was rarer than it should have been. "You are building something larger than a garden," he said one evening in late October, with the cold coming down from the mountains and both of them wrapped in wool. "I am trying to," she said. "If the roses can be established here, the methods and varieties can be shared with anyone in a similar climate. Settlers, homesteaders, small farmers who are trying to make the land work for them rather than against them." She paused. "A great deal of the settlement of this territory has been done badly. Not through bad intentions, necessarily, but through ignorance of what the land requires. People come from the east expecting to farm the way they farmed in Pennsylvania, and the land just kills their efforts." Abraham nodded. He had watched this for years, had watched families arrive and struggle and leave, broken by the gap between what they expected and what the land offered. "What would you do differently?" he asked. "If you could." She looked at him. "I would like to write a practical guide," she said, "on drought-tolerant cultivation for the territories. Specific to this climate, specific to what actually works." She paused. "I have been thinking about it for a while." "You should do it," he said. It was simple and direct and meant without qualification. "It would require time," she said, "and resources and probably a press in Santa Fe." "You have time," he said, "and resources can be found." He looked at her steadily. "And I know a man in Santa Fe who runs a printer's shop." She looked at him. "Do you now?" "His name is Joseph Morin. He printed the deed to my property and our correspondence for the county court. He is a fair man and does good work." Abraham paused. "I could write him a letter of introduction." She was quiet for a moment. The moon was rising over the mountains, half full and casting clean white light across the desert. "You would do that," she said. "I would do more than that," he said, "if you let me." She looked at him in the moonlight and saw the fullness of what he was offering, not just a letter of introduction but his full support, his standing in this territory alongside hers, his faith in her work as completely as he had come to faith in her roses. "Abraham," she said. "Wilhelmina," he said back, and the way he said her name was something she did not have a word for but that she knew she wanted to hear for the rest of her life. She leaned toward him and he met her in the middle, and the first kiss was careful and warm and tasted of the good coffee she had made and of the cold October air, and when they came apart they sat very still for a moment, both of them adjusting to this new state of the world. "I have been wanting to do that since August," he said. "Only since August," she said. He laughed. "Since the fence line," he admitted. "The very first day." "Good," she said. "It was the same for me." They sat together on the porch until the moon was high and the cold drove them inside. And when she drove home that night, she drove slowly. Not because the mules needed to go slowly, but because the night was beautiful and she was in no hurry to be done with it. November came quietly and winter settled over Dusthaven with its particular dry cold, and the romance between Wilhelmina Wilcox and Abraham Vaughn unfolded at the pace of people who are taking something seriously. He came to her property 3 or 4 times a week, helping with wintertime repairs to the cisterns and fencing, and she came to the broken spur to the dinners they took turns cooking. And somewhere in the rotation of those evenings, a comfortable domesticity grew up between them that felt to both of them less like the beginning of something, and more like the recognition of something that had been there all along. George Tillman, who was not a sentimental man, remarked to Abraham one morning that the ranch had a different quality to it lately. Abraham asked what he meant. George considered for a moment and said, "Lighter." Abraham looked at the sky for a moment and said, "Yes," and went to saddle his horse. In December, Abraham asked her to come and meet his sister Margaret, who lived in Albuquerque with her husband and 3 children, and who had been Abraham's closest family since their parents died in 1870. This felt significant to Wilhelmina in the way that meeting family always felt significant, and she said yes, and they made the 2-day trip to Albuquerque in Abraham's wagon in the cold, bright December air. Margaret was a warm, practical woman of about 40 who had her brother's steady eyes and a great deal more ready laughter, and she greeted Wilhelmina with the directness of someone who has been waiting to meet the person her brother has been writing to her about for 4 months. She had 3 children, 2 boys of 8 and 10 and a girl of 6, who regarded Wilhelmina with the frank assessment of children, and then decided she was interesting, primarily because she knew the names of all the plants in Margaret's garden and could explain what each one was doing. "She is exactly what you said," Margaret told Abraham on the second evening, which she thought was a private conversation but which Wilhelmina heard through a door that was slightly less closed than Margaret had realized. "What did I say?" Abraham said. "That she was remarkable," Margaret said. "You said remarkable 3 times in one letter, and you have never used that word once in your whole life as far as I can recall." Abraham was quiet for a moment. "Well," he said. "Yes, indeed, well," Margaret said, with affectionate satisfaction. On the ride back to Dusthaven, Abraham was quieter than usual, and Wilhelmina did not push him, because she had learned that he needed space to arrive at things at his own pace, and that when he did arrive, the arrival was worth the wait. They were about halfway home, camped beside a dry creek bed with a good fire going and the stars extraordinary overhead, when he said, "I want to ask you something, and I am going to ask it plainly because I do not know another way to do it well." "All right," she said. She was sitting across the fire from him with her blanket around her shoulders. "I would like to marry you," he said, "if you will have me. Not because it is the practical thing to do, though it is that. Not because you need my protection, because you have made it entirely clear that you do not need it, which is one of the things He stopped and reformulated. I would like to marry you because I have spent the better part of a year watching you do the impossible with complete confidence, and I cannot imagine the rest of my life without that. Without you." He paused. "I love you, Wilhelmina." The fire popped. The stars blazed. She got up and came around the fire and sat down beside him and took his face in both her hands, which were warm from the fire and capable and real. "I love you too," she said. "I have been loving you since at least August, possibly July." She smiled. Definitely by the fence line. She leaned her forehead against his. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes." He put his arms around her and she settled against him, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down and the stars wheel overhead, and the desert around them was cold and dark and completely silent, and it was one of the best silences either of them had ever sat inside. They were married in February of 1879, in Dusthaven, by Reverend Oakes on one of his regular circuits, in the small church that the town had built the previous spring. The whole town came, which was not an exaggeration because the town was not large. Clara Lund arranged the decorations. Felix and Dario Espinosa served as witnesses. George Tillman, who had not worn a collar in 11 years, wore a collar. Wilhelmina wore her mother's blue dress, which she had kept carefully for years, and she carried a bouquet of dried roses from her own beds, the deep red ones, the impossible ones that bloomed on the driest land in the territory. She had kept them from the summer bloom, dried and preserved, and they held their color beautifully. Abraham looked at her coming down the aisle of the small church, and his face went through an expression that Clara Lund later described to her friend in Santa Fe as entirely undone in the best possible way. He reached for her hand when she reached him, and he held it through the entire ceremony with both of his. The reception was at the Lucky Strike, which had been cleaned up for the occasion, and which served decent food and excellent pie that Clara had organized, and the whole thing had the warm informality of a community celebrating something that felt genuinely earned. Court Dillard was not invited, and did not appear. He had, in the month since his confrontation with Wilhelmina, apparently concluded that the situation was not going to resolve itself in his favor, and had directed his expansion efforts to the north. Nobody missed him. Wilhelmina moved into the Broken Spur that spring, which was a negotiation in itself, because she also needed to maintain her rose beds and irrigation system on her own 40 acres. They worked it out as they worked everything out, by discussing it fully and arriving at a practical solution. She kept her land in her own name, continued her work there with Felix and Dario, and spent the work mornings there and the rest of her time at the ranch. Her stone house became her working studio, stacked with research and correspondence, and the expanding manuscript of the practical guide she was writing. Abraham read drafts of the guide in the evenings, making notes in the margins with the careful hand of someone who is not a writer but who thinks carefully, and his notes were useful in the way that an honest reader who is not an expert is useful. He asked the questions a practical settler would ask, pointed out where her explanations assumed knowledge the audience might not have, suggested additions based on his own experience with the land. "You should have a chapter on water," he said one evening in March, looking up from a section she had given him, specifically on reading the land for underground water. Carter never understood the aquifer under his property. Half the settlers in this territory are sitting on better water than they know. "Can you write that section?" she said. "In rough form I will shape it." He looked at her. "I am not a writer." "You know the subject better than I do," she said. "Write it the way you would explain it to someone new. That is all writing is." He wrote it in 3 sittings at the kitchen table, slowly and carefully, and when she read what he had produced, she changed very little because his way of explaining was clear and grounded and exactly right. Spring came again and the roses woke up. The second year's growth was larger, healthier, more established, and when they bloomed in late June the beds were full of them. The deep red and the lighter pinks and a cream-colored gallica that had been struggling in its first year and had clearly decided in its second year to make up for lost time. The scent on the morning air was astonishing, something that none of Dusthaven's residents had expected to ever smell on their particular stretch of desert, and people came from 5 miles away to walk past the beds and look. A woman named Rosaria Mendez, who had a small farm south of town and had been fighting the land for years, came and spent 2 hours with Wilhelmina asking questions, taking notes, and going home with cuttings of the most drought-hardy variety wrapped carefully in damp cloth. She came back 6 months later to report that the cuttings had taken and were growing, and the look on her face was the same mixture of triumph and disbelief that Wilhelmina remembered feeling in her first blooming. "Tell your neighbors," Wilhelmina said. "Tell anyone who wants to try it." Rosaria did. And Wilhelmina gave cuttings to whoever came and asked, along with the specific instructions about soil preparation and water management that made the difference between a cutting that lived and one that did not. By the end of that second summer, there were small rose beds on 4 properties in the territory besides her own, and each one was a small proof of the thing she had been arguing since she drove into Dusthaven in her wagon with her mules and her wooden crate. The practical guide was published by Joseph Morin's print shop in Santa Fe in the autumn of 1879. Abraham had arranged the financing, which they had discussed thoroughly, and which she had accepted on the condition that she would repay him from any proceeds. A condition he had accepted, because it was clearly important to her independence, even though the sum was not significant to him. The guide was titled Cultivation in Arid Climates, a practical manual for settlers in the New Mexico territory, and was authored by Wilhelmina Wilcox Vaughn, with a chapter on water and aquifer reading by Abraham Vaughn. 200 copies were printed. They were sold out within 4 months. Joseph Morin wrote to say that he had orders for another 300 and was ready to print whenever she said the word. Wilhelmina read the letter aloud to Abraham at breakfast, and he topped up her coffee and said, "Say the word then." And she wrote back to Joseph that morning saying the word. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was a cold one, the coldest Dusthaven had seen in a decade, and Abraham's cattle came through it in better shape than most in the territory because he had spent years building his herd for hardiness, and his pasture management had kept the grass in condition to see the animals through. He was busy through January and February with the kind of daily ranch work that winter made harder, breaking ice on the water troughs, supplementing feed, keeping the weaker animals in the barn. Wilhelmina rode with him on many of these rounds, learning the rhythms of the ranch the way she learned everything, by close observation and direct participation. She was also, by January, expecting their first child, which they had known since December and which had given that cold winter a warmth at its center that nothing outside could touch. Margaret came from Albuquerque in early spring and stayed for a month, which was a gift of such practical magnitude that Wilhelmina found herself moved by it in ways she had not anticipated. Having someone who was family, who was present and easy and loving, was something she had not had since her father died 4 years earlier, and she had not let herself notice how much she had missed it until Margaret was there, and the noticing came with a force that caught her off guard one afternoon in the kitchen. Margaret found her sitting at the table with an expression on her face that Margaret correctly read and said nothing about, simply sat down beside her and put her arm around her and said, "You are allowed to feel it all, you know, the good and the missing at the same time." "I know," Wilhelmina said. "I am just not always practiced at it." "You will be," Margaret said. "We all get practiced at it." The baby arrived in June of 1880, on a hot morning when the roses were in full second-year bloom, and the scent was coming through the open windows of the bedroom. And he was a boy, solid and healthy and dark-haired like his mother, and they named him Carter James Vaughn. Carter for Wilhelmina's uncle who had started it all by holding onto that stubborn piece of land, and James for Abraham's father. Abraham held his son for the first time with an expression that George Tillman, who had driven to town for the doctor and arrived back just in time, said afterward was the most honest thing he had seen on a human face in his life. Abraham did not speak for nearly a full minute. He just looked at Carter James with the complete attention of a man encountering something that has rearranged his entire understanding of what matters. "Hello," he finally said to the baby, very quietly. "I have been waiting for you." Wilhelmina, exhausted and entirely happy, watched this from the bed and thought that she had been right about him from the beginning. Not right about all of it, she had not predicted this. Not exactly. Not the roses blooming and the guide published, and this man and this child in this room. But right about the essential thing, about what was possible if you chose the difficult ground and gave it what it needed. Carter James Vaughn grew through that summer with the single-minded determination of all healthy babies, and his parents took turns at his crib in the nights, and in the morning sat together at breakfast with the baby between them and the desert outside the window, slowly coming to the colors of the day. Felix and Dario Espinosa continued to work Wilhelmina's 40 acres, now with the help of Dario's son Raphael, who was 15 and wanted to learn everything about irrigation. Wilhelmina spent 3 mornings a week there through the summer, moving between the rose beds and the expanded vegetable garden and the 3 fruit trees she had planted the previous autumn, and she brought Carter James in a sling across her chest, and he slept through most of it with the complete confidence of someone who has never had reason to doubt that the world is a safe place. The rose beds on Wilhelmina's land had become, by the summer of 1880, something genuinely spectacular. 2 full years of growth had given the plants real size, real density, and when they bloomed in early June, the color was visible from the main road into Dusthaven. Abraham had heard that 2 travelers had stopped their wagon specifically because they had seen the red from the road and could not believe what it was. He had heard this from Clara Lund, who had heard it from the travelers themselves, who had come into the dry goods store asking who owned that land with the flowers. More cuttings went out that summer. More letters came in, from further away now, from Texas and Arizona and Colorado, and even from a woman in California who had read the practical guide and wanted specific guidance on the most drought-tolerant varieties. Wilhelmina answered them all, some quickly and some at length depending on what they needed, and the correspondence became its own ongoing project. She had begun writing a second guide, this one focused specifically on rose cultivation in arid climates, more technical than the first one and directed at a more specialized audience. And she worked on it in the evenings while Carter James slept and Abraham read at the other end of the table, and the lamp between them was warm and steady. "What will you call this one?" Abraham asked one evening in October, looking up from the agricultural report he was reading. "I am still deciding," she said. She looked at the page in front of her. "Something that says what it is plainly. I do not like coy titles." "No," he agreed. "Roses in the desert is plain. Too plain," she said. "Inaccurate, too. They are not in the desert exactly. They are in a managed microclimate within a desert environment." She tapped her pen. "My mother would have had a title in 30 seconds. She was better at titles than at anything." "What was she like?" Abraham asked. He had asked this before at different times, and she had given him different parts of the answer each time because the whole answer was too large to give at once. Wilhelmina thought for a moment. "Stubborn," she said, "which I have obviously inherited. Brilliant in the way of someone who is more interested in the thing than in being recognized for knowing the thing. She never cared about recognition. She cared about whether the plant lived." She paused. She laughed a lot, more than you would expect from someone who spent most of her time with botanical specimens. She said plants were funny if you paid attention. "Are they?" Abraham said. Wilhelmina smiled. "Sometimes," she said. "The way they problem solve, the way they find the crack in the wall and grow through it. There is something funny about that kind of determination." She looked at the manuscript in front of her. She would have loved Carter James. She loved stubborn things. Abraham looked at his son sleeping in the corner of the room in his small wooden crib, his fists curled up by his face. "He has got plenty of it," he said. "He comes by it honestly," she said. The second guide was finished in the spring of 1881 and sent to Joseph Morin, who printed it enthusiastically and who had by this time become something of a champion for Wilhelmina's work, promoting it actively in Santa Fe and maintaining a correspondence with her about distribution. The second guide, titled eventually Rosa in Arida, The Cultivation of Drought-Tolerant Roses for the American Southwest, sold more copies than the first, faster, and generated enough income that Wilhelmina repaid Abraham his investment in the first guide with interest, which she presented to him in a plain envelope over breakfast one morning. He looked at the envelope and then at her. "You did not need to add the interest," he said. "I calculated the fair interest and added it," she said. "That is what interest is for." He put the envelope down. "Wilhelmina, Abraham." They looked at each other across the breakfast table with Carter James between them, picking cheerfully at his food. And Abraham picked up the envelope and put it in his pocket and said nothing more about it, which was the right response, because she had needed to do that, and he understood that without being told. 1881 moved into 1882 with the steady accumulation of a life being built well. Carter James learned to walk in the late winter of 1881, taking his first steps between his mother's hands, and then careening joyfully toward his father across the kitchen floor. And Abraham caught him and swung him up with a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, but was one of the most vivid things in either of their memories of that year. The roses went into their third growing season with the confidence of established plants, and the beds had grown. Wilhelmina had expanded them twice, adding new varieties she had developed through careful selection, and there was now a bed of a pale gold rose that she had been working on for 3 years that was, in its third summer, finally doing what she had hoped, blooming prolifically in conditions that would have killed a standard variety in 2 weeks. She found Abraham standing at the edge of the gold bed one morning in late June, studying the blooms with the same attention he gave to things he was trying to fully understand. "My mother would have called that one impossible too," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Apparently she taught you to have no patience for impossibility," he said. "She taught me to look at what is actually there rather than what should be there according to other people's theories," Wilhelmina said. She leaned against his shoulder. "The gold was in the genetics. I just had to find the conditions that would allow it to express itself." He put his arm around her. Carter James was in a basket in the shade of the house, supervised by George Tillman, who had become the baby's most unlikely admirer and spent more time with him than could be strictly explained by ranch business. "Wilhelmina," Abraham said. Are you happy here?" She turned to look at him. He was looking at the roses, not at her, and she could see that the question was not casual. "I am very happy here," she said. "This is my life. This is exactly my life." She turned to look at the beds, the house, the wide desert sky. "When I drove in that first morning with Sunday and Patience and my crate of cuttings, I had a plan, but I did not have a picture of what the end looked like. I was not sure what success here would feel like." She paused. "It feels like this." He looked at her then, and the look on his face was the same one she had seen when he first held Carter James utterly unguarded, completely present. "Good," he said. She took his hand and they stood together in the rose beds on the driest land in the territory, with the gold impossible rose blooming beside them and the red impossible roses blooming behind them, and the sun coming down on everything without mercy, and everything growing anyway. The summer of 1882 brought a visitor that no one had anticipated. A woman arrived in Dusthaven in August on the stage from Santa Fe, carrying a leather satchel and a copy of Wilhelmina's second guide with so many annotations in the margins that the pages were crowded with small handwriting. She introduced herself as Dr. Helena Grange, which was a remarkable thing to say in 1882 because women with doctorates were rare enough to constitute a phenomenon, and she had one in botanical science from a university in Germany, where they had accepted women somewhat earlier than the American institutions. She had read both of Wilhelmina's guides and wanted to discuss the methodology and potentially collaborate on a third project, a more comprehensive work on drought adaptation that would place Wilhelmina's practical findings in the broader scientific context of what was being discovered about plant physiology in the leading research centers of Europe. Wilhelmina read Dr. Grange's letter of introduction in the kitchen with an expression that Abraham, watching from across the room, recognized as the one she wore when something she had wanted for a long time had just arrived in a form even better than she had imagined. He made coffee for both of them, put Carter James in his playpen in the corner, and stayed at the other end of the room with his agricultural reports while the two women talked for 4 hours, during which the conversation moved from methodology to plant physiology to the state of women in scientific research to the specific challenges of working in the American Southwest versus European conditions. He got more coffee when the cups were empty. He answered when spoken to. He was, in that way, perfectly suited to the role of quiet, supportive presence, a role he had come to without being asked, and which suited both of them. Dr. Grange stayed in Dusthaven for 2 weeks, during which she and Wilhelmina spent every available hour in the rose beds, or at the kitchen table, or in the small stone house that was still Wilhelmina's studio. The collaboration they agreed on was substantial. Wilhelmina would provide the practical findings, the specific cultivation data, the variety descriptions, and the field observations from 3 years of work in Dusthaven, and Dr. Grange would provide the scientific framework, the laboratory analysis of soil and root samples she would take back to Germany, and the connection to the European botanical community. Abraham shook Dr. Grange's hand when she left and told her she was welcome back any time, and she looked at him with the frank assessment of a scientist and said, "Your wife is doing something important, Mr. Vaughn. I am not certain the American scientific establishment has yet understood how important, but it will." "I know," he said. "She has been doing it since before I knew her." Helena Grange's carriage went down the road toward town, and Wilhelmina watched it go, and Abraham stood beside her and watched her watching it, and he could see in her face something lit from inside, a fire that had always been there but that was now being fed from more directions. "She will be back," he said. "She will," Wilhelmina agreed. She turned to him. "She wants to bring a colleague from Paris next year, a man named Dumont who has been working on similar problems in North Africa. We can feed them," Abraham said. She laughed, which was still one of his favorite sounds in the world after 4 years of hearing it regularly. That autumn, Wilhelmina discovered she was expecting again, and when she told Abraham, his face went through the same sequence it had gone through the first time, which was slightly less dignified and significantly more endearing than anything else she had seen him do. "Are you pleased?" she asked, not because she doubted it but because she liked to hear him say things. "I have not been this pleased since Carter James arrived," he said. "And before that since you said yes at the campfire." He paused. "And before that, all right," she said, laughing. "I understand." Carter James, who was 2 years old and opinionated, was told about the coming sibling in terms he could understand, which was a brief conversation. He seemed most interested in whether the baby would be big enough to play with him immediately, and when informed that this would take some time, accepted the information philosophically and went back to his blocks. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was mild by Dusthaven standards, and Abraham used the easier conditions to begin an expansion of the north barn that he had been planning for 2 years, with Felix's help and a carpenter from town named Aldous Park, who was reliable and skilled. The work took 4 months and resulted in a barn that could shelter significantly more animals through hard weather, which would matter the next time a difficult winter came, and it always came eventually. Wilhelmina worked on her contribution to the joint publication through the winter, writing and revising, and the manuscript grew to something substantial. Hundreds of pages of careful observation organized with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything. She wrote in the mornings while Carter James played and in the evenings while he slept, and Abraham read over her shoulder sometimes and asked questions that sharpened the writing, and sometimes just brought her tea and said nothing, which was equally valuable. The spring of 1883 arrived and the roses came back for their 4th year. And in April, when the first new leaves were appearing on the established plants, and the gold rose was putting out its earliest shoots, their second child arrived. She was a girl, arrived in the morning when the light was just coming up pink over the mountains, and they named her Eleanor, after Abraham's mother, and Rosaria, after the neighbor woman who had come for cuttings and become a friend. And she was small and fierce in the way of second children who arrive knowing they will need to hold their own. Carter James regarded his sister with the serious attention of a 2-year-old scientist confronting a new specimen, and then announced that she was too small to play with, which Abraham told him was currently true but would not always be. George Tillman, who had fully accepted by this point that his role at the Broken Spur had expanded in ways no job description could have predicted, quietly polished the cradle that had held Carter James and carried it to the appropriate room without being asked. The years moved forward in the particular way that good years do, each one adding something to the last, the pattern of the life becoming richer and more settled without losing its energy. The roses on the driest land in the territory bloomed every summer with a regularity that had become, to those who saw it, ordinary in the most extraordinary sense of the word, not ordinary because it was unremarkable, but ordinary because it was dependable, because it was part of the expected order of the year, because you could count on it the way you counted on the sun rising. More properties in the territory had established drought-tolerant plantings, using Wilhelmina's varieties and methods by 1884. A small nursery in Albuquerque had begun propagating some of her varieties commercially, with her knowledge and agreement, and the practical guides were in their 3rd and 4th printings respectively. The joint work with Dr. Grange was published by a scientific press in 1884, receiving notices in botanical journals in Germany, England, and eventually the United States, and Wilhelmina's name appeared in those journals alongside Dr. Grange's with equal billing, which was not always the case for collaborative scientific publications in that era, and which mattered. The territorial newspaper ran a profile of her in the spring of 1884 that was long and detailed, and that quoted Abraham extensively, which he found slightly alarming but which she found entirely appropriate, and which resulted in a letter from the governor of New Mexico Territory expressing official interest in the potential agricultural applications of her work for the territory at large. That letter Abraham read aloud at dinner, the children in bed, the evening quiet around them, and when he was finished he set it on the table and looked at her. She was looking at the letter with an expression he recognized, the long-distance look, the one that meant she was seeing past the immediate thing to the implications of it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said slowly, that if the territorial government is genuinely interested, there is an opportunity to put drought-tolerant cultivation methods into the hands of every small farmer and homesteader in this territory. Formally, through extension programs or demonstration plots or something. She looked up at him. Something that reaches the people who most need it. You should meet with the governor, he said. He is in Santa Fe. We go to Santa Fe. She looked at him. We, Carter James and Alina and you and me, he said. And Sunday and Patience if they are up for it. They are getting old. She smiled at that. Sunday had been slowing down for 2 years and they had acquired a younger mule named Monday to supplement, and Patience, stubborn as always, showed no signs of deteriorating despite her age. We could take the train, she said. There is service now from Albuquerque. The railroad had reached Albuquerque the previous year, and the change it represented was still new enough to feel extraordinary. Abraham had ridden on the train once and been simultaneously impressed and slightly unnerved by it, which he had not admitted to anyone except Wilhelmina. We could take the train, he agreed. The meeting with the governor of the New Mexico Territory took place in June of 1884, in Santa Fe, in an office that was more impressive than it was comfortable, and Wilhelmina brought her guides and her maps and her data, and presented them with the same clear confidence she had been presenting things since she walked into the Dusthaven land office 6 years earlier. The governor was a practical man who understood that agriculture was the foundation of the territory's economy, and that anything that made arid land more productive was worth his attention. He authorized the creation of a demonstration program, demonstration gardens on 3 territorial properties in different parts of the territory, each one using Wilhelmina's methods and varieties, each one open to local settlers to observe and learn from. Wilhelmina would consult, advise, and train the people running them, and the territory would provide a modest funding allocation. It was not everything she had imagined, but it was real, and it was a beginning. And Wilhelmina Wilcox Vaughn, who had driven into Dusthaven with 73 rose cuttings and a plan that nobody believed in, had a very good understanding of what beginnings were worth. She wrote Dr. Grange about it that evening from the hotel, with Carter James and Alina asleep in the adjacent room, and Abraham sitting in the chair beside the window reading with his glasses on, the glasses being a relatively recent addition that he had been reluctant about, and that she found unreasonably endearing. Helena will be pleased, she said. The governor was impressed, Abraham said without looking up from his page. He kept looking at you the way people look at you when you have just explained something that reorganizes their thinking. Is that how I look to people? He looked up then over the glasses. Sometimes, he said. You looked that way to me the first time you explained your planting method, in the kitchen that second week. I drove home thinking about it for the rest of the day. You never said, she said. You had not asked me to believe you yet, he said. You told me you were not asking, she laughed. I remember that. I believed you by August, he said. Considerably before August, if I am being honest, but August was when I said it. She crossed the room and bent and kissed him on the forehead, which made him put the book down and look at her with the full attention he saved for things that mattered. Come to bed, she said. He came. The next few years were full in the way that a life well-constructed tends to be full, not frantic, but occupied, each day doing the work it was designed for and doing it well. The demonstration gardens were established in 1885, and Wilhelmina traveled to each of them twice in the first year to advise and train, leaving the children with Margaret when she needed to go, or sometimes taking Carter James, who at 5 years old was an alert and interested traveler who asked excellent questions. The Broken Spur Ranch continued to prosper under Abraham's careful management, expanding slightly in 1886 when the property to the east came available, and Abraham bought it at a fair price, adding good pasture to his existing range. He had a reputation by this time as one of the most reliable ranchers in the territory. His cattle were consistently healthy, his operations honest, His relationships with neighboring properties and with the people who worked for him, marked by the same straightforward fairness that had characterized him since before Wilhelmina had arrived to notice it. George Tillman was still foreman, showing no inclination to retire, and Felix Espinosa's son Raphael had grown into a capable young man, who was now the primary worker on Wilhelmina's 40 acres, bringing the same reliability as his father and uncle, and a particular gift for the irrigation work that was the heart of making the land perform. Carter James started school in Dusthaven in 1886 and proved to be exactly as determinedly curious as his parents in different ways, interested in everything, good at mathematics and at anything involving careful observation. Eleanor, at 3, was less interested in observation and more interested in participation, and had strong views about most things, which she expressed clearly and often. Abraham watched his daughter announce her views on the placement of his coffee cup one morning and said to Wilhelmina, who was laughing, "She is exactly like you." "She is not," Wilhelmina said. "She is," he said, "down to the way she looks at you when she thinks you are wrong about something." "How do I look at you when I think you are wrong about something?" "Like you are being very patient with me," he said. She looked at him, and he could see her trying to determine whether he was right, and the look on her face as she did it was precisely the one he had just described, and they both started laughing at the same time. The Dusthaven Wilhelmina had driven into in 1878 had changed in the years since. A second general store had opened. The school had moved into a proper building. The Lucky Strike had a rival saloon now, which it regarded with contempt and which it was losing ground to, because the rival had better food. 2 doctors had come through and 1 had stayed. The railroad's arrival in Albuquerque had improved supply chains for the whole region, and the general hardship of isolated frontier life had eased slightly, in the way things eased when the infrastructure of civilization caught up to the ambition of the settlers. The roses on the driest land in the territory were, by 1887, something that visitors to Dusthaven specifically asked about. A woman from Denver had come to write about them for a magazine. A photographer had arrived with his equipment and spent a morning in the beds and produced images that Wilhelmina had framed and that hung in the stone house that was still her studio. The Gold Rose had been officially named. She had been asked to provide a cultivar name for the commercial nursery's catalog, and after considerable thought she had named it Rosa Damascena Rosaria, for her neighbor and friend, and Rosaria Mendez had cried when she heard it, which made Wilhelmina cry, which was somewhat unusual for her, and which made Abraham put down whatever he was holding and go and put his arms around both of them. In the spring of 1888, 10 years after Wilhelmina had driven her wagon into Dusthaven, she was 36 years old and Abraham was 44, and Carter James was 8 and Eleanor was 5. And Sunday the mule had finally and peacefully died in the paddock the previous autumn at a considerable age, and Patience was showing her years but still going. And Monday had been joined by a younger mule named Tuesday, because the children had decided on the naming convention, and it appeared to be permanent. It was a morning in April, the roses just beginning their 5th-generation growth now, the beds established over a full decade, and the plants as permanent as anything in the landscape, when Wilhelmina stood at the edge of the beds in the early light and looked at what she had made. The beds stretched across a quarter of the 40 acres, deep green and organized and alive with new growth, the old canes of the established plants thick as a finger, the new growth red-brown and vigorous. The irrigation channels ran clean, and the cisterns were full from the winter rains. Beyond the beds, the vegetable garden was planted and the fruit trees, there were 5 now, the original 3 plus 2 she had added were blossoming white and pink. Beyond all of it was the desert, the same red and brown and gray of the land that had been here for longer than any of them and that would be here after all of them, indifferent and beautiful and harsh, the driest land in the territory. She had not changed the land. She had understood it, which was a different and better thing. She heard him coming before she saw him, the familiar sound of his horse on the track from the broken spur, and she turned and watched him come. He looked the same as he had always looked to her, solid and steady and real, his hat pulled low against the morning light, his hands easy on the reins. He pulled up beside the fence and dismounted and tied the horse and climbed over, the same way he had climbed over 10 years ago in the wind to help her with the cloth. He came and stood beside her and looked at the beds. They stood together in the quiet of the morning with the roses growing around them, and after a while he said, "I have been thinking about something." "What have you been thinking about?" she said. "That letter from the university in Albuquerque," he said. The University of New Mexico had been established in 1889. This was still 1888, but there were discussions already happening, planning, and a letter had come to Wilhelmina in March from a committee that was developing the curriculum, asking if she would be willing to advise on the inclusion of botanical and agricultural sciences, given her work in drought-tolerant cultivation. "What about it?" she said. "I think you should take a formal role," he said, "if they offer one. Lecturer, advisor, whatever they call it." He looked at her. "You have been teaching informally for 10 years. Through the guides, through the demonstration gardens, through every cutting you have given and every letter you have answered. A formal appointment would give that work the standing it deserves." She looked at him. "It would mean travel, Santa Fe, Albuquerque." "Yes," he said. "It would mean time away from the ranch, from the children. Carter James is 8 and Alina is 5, and they are both healthy and capable, and George and I and Margaret between us can manage," he said. "You know this." "You have already thought through the practicalities," she said. "I thought through the practicalities the night after I read the letter," he said. "I have been waiting for the right moment to say it." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the roses, and he let her be quiet because he understood that she was not hesitating, she was arriving. "My mother never got to teach formally," she said. "Never got to have that standing. She could not because they would not give it to her." She looked at the beds. "Things change slowly." "They do," he said, "but they change." She turned to him fully, and he saw her face in the morning light, 10 years older than it had been when she drove into Dusthaven, still exactly itself, the dark eyes and the set jaw and the intelligence that looked at everything with the same interested, patient, working attention. "I would like to do it," she said. "I know," he said. "I would like to do it, and I would like you beside me while I do it," she said. "Not because I cannot do it without you, but because I want to." He reached out and touched her face, his callous thumb gentle against her cheek. "I am beside you," he said. "I have been since August." "Since the fence line," she said. "Since the fence line," he agreed. She leaned into his hand for a moment, and they stood in the rose beds on the driest land in the territory, with the morning coming up gold and the fragrance of 10 years of impossible growth all around them. Carter James came running from the direction of the house, 8 years old and possessed of inexhaustible energy, with Alina 2 steps behind him doing her best to keep up on her shorter legs, her face absolutely set with determination. "Papa," Carter James announced breathlessly. "Alina ate my breakfast." "I ate my breakfast," Alina corrected with great dignity, "and then I also ate some of his because he was too slow." Abraham looked at them and then at Wilhelmina, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was very happy and trying to contain it to a respectable level, which he was not very successful at. "Come and look at the roses," Wilhelmina said to her children. She held out her hands and they came, Carter James taking one hand and Alina taking the other, and she brought them into the beds the way she had been doing since they were small enough to be carried, and she said the names of the varieties as they walked, and they listened with varying degrees of attention, but always with the underlying certainty that this was important, that this growing thing was the foundation of something larger than itself. Abraham walked beside them and watched his family among the roses, and the desert stretched out around them under the vast New Mexico sky, and everything he saw was more than he had once thought to hope for. The Rose Guide was used in schools by 1890. The demonstration gardens had expanded to 7 properties across the territory. The University of New Mexico opened, and Wilhelmina Wilcox Vaughn was among its first lecturers in agricultural science, traveling to Albuquerque 4 times a year to teach and remaining in regular correspondence with the program in between. Dr. Helena Grange visited Dusthaven again in 1890, this time with her colleague from Paris, a gracious man named Dumont who spoke limited English, but had enough of it to express adequately his astonishment at the rose beds, and the three of them spent a week in deep and joyful scientific conversation that Abraham participated in at the edges, contributing the practical rancher's perspective and making excellent coffee throughout. Carter James, at 10 years old, had developed a particular interest in the water management aspects of his mother's work, spending hours with Raphael at the irrigation channels, asking how things worked and why, and what would happen if. Abraham watched this and said nothing, but Wilhelmina caught him watching and knew what he was thinking. "He is going to be something," she said one evening. "He already is," Abraham said. Alina, at 7, was more interested in the roses themselves than in the engineering of their survival, and spent a great deal of time in the beds when permitted, examining blooms with the close attention of a future botanist or a future artist. It was not yet clear which, and possibly both. She had begun pressing flowers and organizing them in a notebook with annotations in her careful child's handwriting, and Wilhelmina had looked at that notebook one evening and felt something so powerful and specific that she had to set it down and compose herself for a moment before she could speak. "What is it?" Abraham had asked. "It is my mother's notebook," she said. "The method, the organizing, the annotation, it is exactly what she did." She looked at him. "Alina has never seen her great-grandmother's notebooks. I have them in the studio, but I have not shown her." "Perhaps it is inherited," Abraham said quietly. "Perhaps," she said. She looked at the notebook, at the small, careful handwriting. "Or perhaps it is simply the right way to pay attention to something." She brought out her mother's notebooks that evening and showed them to Alina, and Alina turned the pages with the reverence of someone handling something old and precious, and she asked questions about the woman who had made them, and Wilhelmina answered them all, telling her daughter about her grandmother in the most complete way she had ever told anyone. The whole story, the brilliance and the stubbornness and the garden in St. Louis, and the work that had been continued and brought here to this land, to this bloom. Alina listened with her dark eyes wide and then looked at her mother and said, "She was like you." "I am like her," Wilhelmina said. "There is a difference." Alina considered this. "She started it and you carried it," she said. "Yes," Wilhelmina said, and she smiled. "And now you are here." Alina nodded, as though a question she had been asking had just been answered. She closed the notebook carefully and handed it back, and then went to get her own notebook and brought it and sat beside her mother at the table and kept working in it, side by side. Abraham came in and saw them there. The two of them bent over their notebooks in the lamplight, dark heads similarly inclined, the same quality of attention in both faces, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at them. He had said, the first year, that he believed her now. He had believed in the roses because they bloomed. He had believed in the woman because she made impossible things happen through patience and intelligence and refusal to accept other people's definitions of what was possible. He had believed in the life they had built because he could see it, every day, in the children and the land and the work, and the table between them at breakfast. He believed in all of it still. He believed in it with everything he had, in the full and quiet and certain way of a man who has found what matters and given it his complete attention. He stepped inside and closed the door against the evening air and went to put the kettle on, and the lamplight was warm across his family, and outside, invisible in the dark but deeply there, the roses rested on the driest land in the territory, alive and rooted and waiting for morning. The years continued. The work continued. The love between them continued, not unchanged but deepened, the way good things deepen when they are tended, the way roots go further into the earth in the second decade than in the first, becoming part of the landscape itself rather than merely planted in it. Carter James grew into a young man with his mother's systematic mind and his father's steadiness. And by his early teenage years, he was a genuine contributor to the water management work on the 40 acres, developing an instinct for irrigation problems that Raphael said, admiringly, was almost uncomfortable to watch in someone so young. He was going to study engineering when the time came, he said, to combine it with the agricultural work, and Wilhelmina had written to the university in Albuquerque about possibilities and received encouraging replies. Alina grew into a young woman who was both botanist and artist as it turned out, and who had started at 12, keeping a detailed illustrated record of the rose beds through the seasons, a project that Dr. Grange, on her next visit, said was scientifically valuable as well as visually extraordinary, and that she would like to include excerpts from in a future publication if Alina would permit it. Alina had said yes with the contained pleasure of someone being recognized for work they had done carefully and on purpose. The first cold morning of October in 1892, Wilhelmina stood in the rose beds one more time in the early light and looked at what had become of a crate of cuttings and a plan, and a determination that had never wavered even when every reasonable voice in Dusthaven had said it could not be done. The beds were 14 years established now. The plants were old friends, each one known to her individually, their habits and their particular responses to the seasons as familiar as the habits of people she loved. Abraham came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him. "The gold rose has 37 buds," she said. "I counted this morning." 37, he said. "Better than last year." "Much better," she said. "The soil has changed. 14 years of organic matter and careful management. It is completely different from what it was." She looked at the ground beneath the plants, rich dark against the pale caliche of the undisturbed desert. "I changed it by working with what it was." "Yes," he said. He rested his chin against her hair. "You have a gift for that." She turned in his arms and looked up at him. 40 and 48, lines at the corners of their eyes, gray beginning at his temples, and she had never in her life been less interested in the passing of time as something to resist. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for 14 years, and I will love you for the rest of our lives, and probably beyond that if there is a beyond, which I do not know the answer to, but which my mother would have had an opinion about." He laughed, which she still loved, which was still one of the best sounds she knew. "I love you," he said. "I loved you from the fence line. I have never once stopped." She kissed him in the rose beds, with the October morning going gold around them, and the 37 buds of the impossible gold rose waiting for the next spring, and the whole settled, built, real, alive thing of their life spread out around them in every direction. The ranch to the north, the stone studio to the south, the children growing up inside the shape of it, the work going forward into the world in every guide and cutting and letter and student. The land itself transformed by 14 years of being understood rather than overridden. She had planted roses on the driest land in the territory. She had done what every reasonable person had said could not be done, because she was not particularly interested in the limits of reasonable people's imaginations, and because she had spent 6 years before she ever arrived in Dusthaven preparing for exactly this, and because she had looked at the land and seen not what it lacked but what it was, and worked with that. And the rancher who had watched her from the fence line, who had given her 2 weeks and then 3, who had ridden over in the wind and held the pole and gone home thinking about her, and come back 3 days later and kept coming back, who had said at the fence line on a hot August morning in 1878 that she was the most remarkable thing he had encountered in 34 years of paying close attention to the world. That rancher had stood beside her in August with the red roses blooming all around them and said, simply, "I believe you now." He had never stopped believing. And so the roses bloomed on the driest land in the territory, year after year, each year more beautiful than the last, and the life around them bloomed the same way, built from patience and knowledge and love, and the stubborn refusal to accept anyone else's definition of what was possible here, in this impossible, beautiful, difficult, extraordinary place. It was everything. It was exactly enough.